You're looking at a number that should terrify every American policymaker, and most of them don't even know it exists. I'm Michael Johnson, and for the past 24 hours, I've been staring at a single statistic that changes everything we thought we knew about North American trade. That number? 59%. It sounds innocuous enough, maybe even reassuring if you're used to thinking about Canada as America's economic dependent. But I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't the number going up. This is the number going down. And the speed at which it's falling? That's what should keep Washington awake at night. Picture me 3 days ago, sitting in my office in Seattle, rain beating against the windows, when an email arrived from a source I've cultivated inside Statistics Canada for the better part of a decade. The subject line was simple. You asked about trade diversification. The attachment was a spreadsheet. But when I opened those numbers, everything I thought I understood about the Canada-U.S. relationship shifted beneath my feet. Here's what most Americans don't realize. When we talk about Canada being dependent on U.S. markets, we're talking about yesterday's reality. The 59% figure that economists throw around, that's Canada's current trade dependence on American markets. But here's the part that should make every American business owner pay attention. Just 5 years ago, that number was 76%. Let me repeat that because it's crucial. In half a decade, Canada has reduced its economic dependence on the United States by 17 percentage points. That's not gradual diversification. That's systematic restructuring. But here's what makes this story absolutely explosive. This didn't happen by accident. You see, there's something about those leaked documents from my Statistics Canada source that most trade analysts would miss. Hidden in the appendices, buried beneath columns of export data and commodity classifications, was a reference to something called the Strategic Market Diversification Initiative. 3 words that represent the most significant economic realignment in North America since NAFTA, and somehow nobody in Washington seems to know it exists. Every American who's ever bought Canadian lumber, eaten Canadian wheat, or filled their car with Canadian oil needs to understand what's happening right now. Because this isn't just about trade statistics. This is about power, leverage, and the slow-motion collapse of assumptions that have shaped North American policy for 75 years. But before I tell you exactly what Canada is building as an alternative to American markets, you need to understand how we got here. Because the 59% number isn't just a statistic. It's a warning. I remember the exact moment I realized something fundamental had shifted in the Canada-U.S. relationship. It was February 2025, and I was covering what seemed like a routine trade dispute. Canadian tourism to the United States had dropped 40% compared to the same month the previous year. Politicians were spinning it as temporary friction, the kind of cross-border tension that always resolves itself given time and cooler heads. But there was something different about this dispute that I couldn't quite identify until I started digging into the numbers. This wasn't Canadians staying home because they couldn't afford to travel. According to internal polling data I eventually obtained from Abacus data, 62% of Canadians were actively choosing to avoid traveling to the United States for at least the next year. Think about what that means. Canada's largest trading partner had become so politically unstable, so unpredictable in its treatment of allies, that ordinary citizens were making conscious economic choices to spend their money elsewhere. A Snowbird Advisor survey found that Canadian winter travelers were increasingly choosing international destinations other than the United States. Mexico, Costa Rica, warmer European countries, all benefiting from Canadians looking for sunshine without what one respondent called the political baggage of supporting Trump. But here's where the story gets interesting. While Americans were focused on Canadian tourists choosing European vacations, something much bigger was happening in corporate boardrooms across Canada. The Strategic Market Diversification Initiative I mentioned, according to internal government documents I've reviewed, it wasn't just about reducing exposure to American political volatility. It was about building systematic alternatives to U.S.-dependent supply chains, creating new trade pathways, and establishing relationships with partners who treat Canada as an equal rather than a junior participant. And the results are already reshaping North American economics in ways most Americans don't realize. Let me show you what 59% dependence actually looks like when you break it down sector by sector, because that's where you see the strategy at work. Canadian energy exports still flow primarily to American markets. Geography makes that inevitable. Canadian agricultural products still feed American consumers in massive volumes. But here's what's changing. The value-added manufacturing, the processed goods, the high-tech components, the services sector. These are where Canada is systematically building alternatives. According to trade data I've analyzed, Canadian exports to Europe increased by 23% between 2023 and 2024. Exports to Asia-Pacific markets rose by 31% in the same period. Meanwhile, exports to the United States grew by just 4%. Canada isn't abandoning the American market, but it's no longer putting all its economic eggs in the American basket. But there's something even more significant happening that the 59% number doesn't capture: the direction of investment flows. I spent last month tracking Canadian corporate investment patterns, and what I found should concern every American who thinks geographic proximity guarantees economic partnership. Canadian companies are increasingly investing in European operations, Asian partnerships, and domestic capacity rather than U.S.-focused expansion. When Canadian Pacific Kansas City built new grain transportation infrastructure, much of that capacity was designed to serve Mexican and overseas markets, not American ports. When McCain Foods, one of Canada's largest food processors, announced expansion plans, those plans prioritized European facilities over American ones. When Canadian mining companies secured new contracts for critical minerals, increasingly those contracts were with European manufacturers rather than American ones. This isn't anti-American sentiment driving these decisions. This is risk management. And the risk Canadian companies are managing? Political uncertainty in their largest traditional market. But here's where this story takes a turn that even I didn't see coming until I started connecting dots across multiple sectors. Canada isn't just diversifying away from dependence on American markets. They're building the infrastructure to make that diversification permanent. Remember when Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney secured Canada's entry into the European Union's Safe Defense Program in December 2025? Most analysts treated that as a military story, a response to Trump's tariff threats and annexation rhetoric. But when you understand it as part of the Strategic Market Diversification Initiative, it becomes something much bigger. Canada building systematic alternatives to American-dominated institutions. The SAFE program isn't just about defense contracts. It's about supply chains, technology sharing, industrial cooperation, and financial partnerships that create structural alternatives to U.S.-dependent economic relationships. When Canada gained access to 244 billion Canadian dollars in European defense financing, they gained something more valuable than money. They gained options, and options in international economics are power. Let me tell you about a conversation I had last month with a senior executive at a major Canadian resource company who asked not to be identified. We were discussing his company's expansion plans, and he said something that stuck with me. For decades, we planned everything around American demand. American environmental standards, American political cycles, American currency fluctuations. We built our entire business model around the assumption that the U.S. market was stable and predictable. Then he paused, looked out his office window toward the Peace River, and continued. That assumption proved wrong. So now we plan around multiple markets, multiple currencies, multiple political systems. It's more complicated, but it's also more stable. That's the 59% story in a nutshell. Canada learning that dependence on a single market, no matter how large or geographically convenient, is a vulnerability that recent events have proven too costly to maintain. But here's what makes this personal for every American. This isn't just about Canadian companies finding new customers. This is about American companies losing access to integrated supply chains that made North American manufacturing globally competitive. I spent 2 weeks last month visiting manufacturing facilities across the Great Lakes region, talking to executives whose operations depend on Canadian inputs. What I found was a quiet crisis that most Americans don't realize is happening. Canadian suppliers who used to prioritize American customers are increasingly treating those relationships as conditional rather than automatic. One automotive parts manufacturer in Michigan told me his Canadian suppliers now require longer-term contracts, more stable payment terms, and written guarantees against political disruption. Another manufacturer in Ohio said his Canadian partners are actively building relationships with European and Asian customers as insurance against American market volatility. This isn't suppliers being difficult or vindictive. This is suppliers learning that reliability now matters more than proximity. And when suppliers prioritize reliability over proximity, geographic advantages start to erode. Here's a number that should terrify American trade officials. According to data I've obtained from the Canadian Transportation Agency, Canadian railway companies are increasingly investing in infrastructure that serves non-American markets. CPKC's expansion plans prioritize routes to Mexico and connections to Pacific ports for Asian trade. CN Rail is upgrading capacity to eastern Canadian ports that serve European markets. This represents a fundamental shift in continental logistics. For 75 years, Canadian transportation infrastructure was built around the assumption that goods would flow primarily to American markets. That assumption is being systematically replaced by infrastructure designed to serve global markets. And once that infrastructure is in place, it doesn't get rebuilt just because political relationships improve. But there's an even deeper story hidden in the 59% number that most economists miss entirely: the psychology of economic partnership. I've been interviewing Canadian business leaders for 3 months, and what I've learned is that the diversification away from American markets isn't just about spreading risk. It's about dignity. Canadian companies are tired of being treated as junior partners in economic relationships where they provide critical inputs but have no voice in decision-making. When Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, he didn't just raise costs for Canadian producers. He demonstrated that Canadian economic interests could be sacrificed for American political theater without consultation or consideration. When he threatened to tear up NAFTA, he showed Canadian businesses that decades of integration and cooperation could be discarded on presidential whim. The message Canadian companies received was clear. Your partnership is valued only when it serves American interests, and American interests can change unpredictably. So Canadian companies responded by building relationships with partners who treat them as equals rather than dependents. The European Union negotiates with Canada as a sovereign equal. Asian markets compete for Canadian resources and expertise. Even Mexico offers more predictable partnership terms than recent American administrations. This isn't Canada choosing inferior economic relationships. This is Canada choosing dignified economic relationships. And dignity, once lost in economic partnerships, is extraordinarily difficult to restore. Let me share something that happened last week that perfectly illustrates how this psychology plays out in real business decisions. I was on a call with executives from a major Canadian energy company discussing their expansion plans. The conversation naturally turned to American markets, which still represent their largest customer base. But when I asked about long-term investment priorities, something interesting happened. Every major new project they described, pipeline infrastructure, processing facilities, exploration partnerships, was designed to serve multiple markets rather than maximize American sales. When I pressed on why they were essentially building around American demand rather than optimizing for it, one executive was refreshingly direct. We learned that betting everything on American stability was a mistake, not because Americans are hostile, but because American politics makes long-term planning impossible. That's the 59% story from the inside. Canadian companies aren't abandoning American markets, but they're no longer building their futures around them. And when companies stop building their futures around your market, your leverage in that relationship begins to evaporate. Here's something most Americans don't understand about the current trade relationship. The 59% dependence number actually understates how much Canada has already diversified. That figure includes energy exports, which are largely locked in by geography and infrastructure. When you look at manufactured goods, processed products, and services, the sectors where companies have real choice about market focus, Canadian dependence on American demand has fallen much more dramatically. According to trade data I've analyzed, Canadian manufacturers now send less than 45% of their exports to the United States, down from nearly 80% just a decade ago. Canadian technology companies are increasingly focused on European and Asian markets. Canadian financial services companies are building partnerships across the Pacific and Atlantic, rather than just south of the border. This represents the most significant restructuring of Canadian economic orientation since Confederation, and it's happening so gradually that most Americans haven't noticed. But American companies are starting to notice, and what they're discovering should concern every American who cares about continental competitiveness. Last month, I attended a manufacturing conference in Detroit where the unofficial theme seemed to be the Canadian problem. Not because Canadian suppliers were being difficult, but because they were becoming less available. Companies that used to bid aggressively for American contracts were increasingly selective. Suppliers who used to offer preferential terms to American customers were treating those relationships as purely transactional. One automotive executive summed it up perfectly. "It used to feel like Canadian companies needed us more than we needed them. Now it feels like they have other options and they're not afraid to use them." That shift in bargaining power is already showing up in contract negotiations, pricing discussions, and long-term supply agreements. American companies are discovering that Canadian partners now expect to be treated as equals rather than grateful dependents. And equality in business relationships usually means higher costs and less favorable terms for the previously dominant partner. But here's where this story becomes truly significant for American strategic interests. The 59% number isn't just about trade flows. It's about the foundation of American influence in North America. For 75 years, American foreign policy in North America has been built on one fundamental assumption: that Canada's economic dependence on the U.S. market would guarantee political alignment on major issues. When Washington needed support for military interventions, economic sanctions, or diplomatic initiatives, Canadian cooperation was largely taken for granted because the economic costs of non-cooperation were too high. That assumption is now being systematically dismantled. When Canada joined the EU's Safe Defence Program, it wasn't just gaining access to European defence contracts, it was reducing its dependence on American security guarantees. When Canadian companies build European production facilities, they're not just serving European markets, they're creating alternatives to American-dominated supply chains. Every percentage point of reduced trade dependence represents a percentage point of reduced American leverage, and leverage, once lost in international relationships, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. I want you to consider what North American geopolitics looks like when Canada is no longer economically dependent on American markets, when Canadian governments can pursue policies that Washington opposes without facing devastating economic consequences, when Canadian companies can choose European or Asian partners over American ones without sacrificing their global competitiveness. That world isn't a hypothetical future scenario. According to the trends I'm tracking, it could be the reality within what analysts project could be the next decade, and most Americans have no idea it's coming. Here's what the 59% number really means. It means the era of automatic Canadian deference to American interests is ending. It means North American economic integration is being replaced by Canadian global integration. It means the assumptions that have shaped American policy toward its northern neighbor for 3/4 of a century are becoming obsolete. The question isn't whether this transformation will continue. The infrastructure investments, trade relationships, and political partnerships that Canada has built to reduce American dependence are already irreversible. The question is whether American policymakers will recognize what's happening in time to adapt to a new reality. Because adaptations made proactively are usually more favorable than adaptations forced by circumstances. And right now, Canada is adapting proactively while America is still operating on yesterday's assumptions about today's realities. The 59% isn't just a number, it's a countdown, and every month that passes, every quarter that shows continued diversification, every year that Canadian companies grow more comfortable with non-American alternatives, that number is going to continue falling, until one day Americans wake up to discover that their northern neighbor has become an independent economic actor rather than a reliable dependent. And by then, the relationship between equals that Canada has been building with the rest of the world will be the new normal. Whether America is part of that equals-based relationship or outside looking in. That depends on choices being made right now by people who may not realize how much the game has already changed.